All right, welcome and happy Friday, Changemakers. As folks begin to trickle in, just want to say thank you all for being here today and being present. And we're really excited about the space we're about to share over this next hour. My name is Gerald Corporal, and I use he, him, his pronouns. Just to describe myself, I identify as Asian American and Filipino American. I have short black hair, and I'm currently wearing a light blue button-up shirt against a navy background. I'm a staff member for your UCLA Alumni Association and also proudly a member of the planning committee that is putting on this summit. So on behalf of the committee, we're really excited to welcome you all to our session titled Building an Anti-Racist Workplace. The Alumni Association wants to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva people as the original land caretakers of the Tovangar. As a land-grant institution, we want to pay our respect to our Honuk Vitam, our ancestors, Ahihiram, our elders, and our Iohikinkum, our relatives, past, present, and emerging. And now I am very excited to introduce our incredible panel and moderator that we have today. We ask our attendees to reference their biographies to learn more about them on our panel, on our summit webpage, and we'll also include that link on our chat box. Today, our panel consists of two wonderful alumni, Dr. Raja Bhattar, MA class of 2015 and PhD class of 2019, as well as Anis Hasnain, UCLA class of 2013. And we also have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Tiffany Bowden and Alfredo Del Cid. And this wonderful conversation will be facilitated by our moderator, Araceli Almazan, who is a UCLA class of 2004 and a member of our UCLA Alumni Association Board of Directors. And so with that, Araceli, happy to turn it over to you to begin this conversation.
Thanks, Gerald. I want to welcome everyone today. As Gerald mentioned, my name is Araceli. I'm a UCLA Alumni Board member. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I identify as Latina. I am wearing a white blouse against a blue backdrop. And first off, before we start, I'd like to thank UCLA and every department that made the summit possible. I'm very proud to be an alumni of an academic institution that believes in the importance of shedding light on these topics and fosters the space for us to have this type of conversation today. So without further ado, I'd like to start off by posing a question to all our panelists. The first question, and it'll be answered in the following order. Raja will answer, followed by Anis, Alfredo, and Dr. Bowden. So the first question for everyone, what does an anti-racist workplace look like to you? Raja?
Thanks, Araceli, and thanks everyone for organizing this. My name is Raja, they, them pronouns from Tongva land. Really honored and excited to be with my Bruin community. Most of my work, particularly academically, is around this idea of belonging and sense of belonging. And I feel like an anti-racist workplace is where people of all racial identities actually feel like they belong and are valued for the skills that they bring, not in spite of their racial identities or experiences, but actually because of their racial identities and rich culture. And so really feeling like there's an active, intentional work to dismantle structures that in our capitalistic Western US systems are often built on racist practices and policies. And so folks that are actually able to intentionally lead by dismantling and rebuilding with thoughtfulness.
Anis?
Sure. So hi, folks. Anis Hasnain, she, her pronouns. Really excited to be here. Fun fact, when I was at UCLA, Raja was a critical part of the LGBT center on campus. So it's full circle to be sharing this space. When I think about anti-racism in the workplace, in some ways it feels like a very deep oxymoron. Right? Because so often when we think about the workplace, we're thinking about what that means within a capitalistic structure. And I just wanted to amplify that from what Raja just shared. So, as we're exploring what anti-racism can look like, I think it's both the decentering of whiteness, the decentering of everything from white supremacy to white comfort, and uplifting the global majority, to be quite frank, but also really evaluating the intersection of white supremacy and capitalism, right? How our wage labor becomes another tool of how racist systems and structures are upheld. So those are types of things that I'm thinking about, at least when we consider what does a workplace environment, or perhaps reframed, a collaborative space where we're working towards shared community goals, perhaps rooted in mutual aid, look like, that is anti-racist in nature.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Tiffany Bowden, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm wearing a orangish color sweater against a wooden backdrop. It's got some holes in it. That's the best way I can describe it. I have to agree with Anise on many of the things that she said here. In that it can really feel like an oxymoron in terms of anti-racism workplace. And that is because of that, that conflation of capitalism and also trying to do this work at the same time. And when you are truly doing anti-racism work, you are really going at the system itself. And, we have to really grapple with the fact that many of these businesses are in place and benefit from white supremacy. And so when you are a practitioner within these spaces, sometimes you are having to go against your own stakeholders, your own customers, your managers, your colleagues about what they might view and have data for as good for the business, has always been good for the business, but it's just simply not the right way to go. And perhaps the argument is more about what's actually good for the business long term is an inclusive workplace, and your business model perhaps needs to change. So an anti-racism workplace is one that's willing to take those risks and take those hits and understand that we are investing in an inclusive future. And like all investments, sometimes that means that you take a dip before you actually have that expansion, but sometimes you have that expansion right away, but you have to be willing to take those risks. And if you're not willing to take those risks and you're not willing to take on that mantle, then you need to be honest about that too, and understand that you are at effect comfortable with upholding white supremacy, and ultimately what does that mean? So we get into several uncomfortable conversations in that regard when it comes to anti-racism in the workplace. Frequently comes up.
Alfredo?
Thank you. I'm just already getting so excited about this conversation, and we're just getting started, just hearing these amazing perspectives and responses. For me, I always think about, for me, an anti-racist organization is one that looks inward, right? One that constantly reflects on what are the policies, what are the practices, what are the systems that they have in place that are perpetuating racism, right? I often talk to clients about this idea of, employees of color thriving, right? But what does it mean if they're thriving only when they are in proximity to whiteness, or when they're being asked to assimilate and cover, right? And so if that's what we're asking folks to do in order to say you belong, then you're not an anti-racist organization, right? You're in fact perpetuating it under the guise of inclusion and belonging. And so I often, get my clients to really think critically about how often are you evaluating the practices you have? And when you're asking people if they feel like they belong, are you asking them to assimilate, right? Because ultimately that will have an impact in someone's experience, particularly a person of color. So I always think about that, that inward reflection as an organization that has to happen continuously.
So our next question is for anyone on the panel who'd like to answer this. The question is, what are some examples of pervasive racist structures that exist in many workplaces today?
I'll start, and I forgot to do an introduction of my own appearance. So I am a darker skinned, shaved headed brown queer person with my perfect shade of lipstick on and a black t-shirt. That's one of my favorite quotes by Sandra Oh that says it's an honor just to be Asian, and a scarf, a shawl surrounded by green plants and books and art. I would say thinking about really everything is racist in most workplaces. I don't know if there's any particular examples. It's like literally the structure itself, whether it's promotion strategies, what is considered, to what Alfredo and Tiffany said, what are considered professional, right? And how we define professional, who's considered professional, expectations around dress and thinking about outfits and clothing that you're expected to have, hairstyles, and whether or not you're allowed to wear a turban or a hijab, and who's, are you able to get breaks to actually practice your religious practices, and are you forced to do that in some random break room? Do you have the resources to actually take care of your children in the workplace? And are you able to breastfeed in this space? Those all practices that often are interconnected to race, which often we don't talk about, and so the intersectionality is deep. But I would say even just the hierarchical power structure of the way we think about organizations with CEOs and boards and managers and directors, like that all feels really white supremacist in nature, not just racist.
I also apologize. I did not introduce myself and describe myself. My name is Alfredo, they, them pronouns. I am a queer immigrant, Latinx, first generation, individual. My background is there's art, there's books, and there's a couple of toys, a few toys that I really like to collect. But to this answer specifically, I was thinking about this earlier of what are those practices that maybe once we think about it, it's kind of like this aha moment. For me, I was thinking of pay transparency, right? To me, the fact that the lack of pay transparency is part of racism, right? That's because that's how we keep those divisions, right? We often talk about the pay inequity that exists among particularly women of color, Black women, Latinx women, and women in color in general. But one of the systems that perpetuates that is this lack of transparency, right? And so even those practices that we might not, immediately think of as racist, to perpetuate it, right? Perpetuate racism, perpetuate that division, that inequity. And so I think it's always critical to look at those, small, policies, or even just practices, cultural norms that we have within an office that are perpetuating racism.
Thank you for those very insightful answers. The next question is for Raja. Raja, how can you go about identifying racist practices and structures in your workplace? How can you assess the climate of your work environment in regard to racism?
Yeah, this is the work that we do, right? This is why I like being an organizer and a consultant, because I get to go in and be that external vision, because often we're so mired in the water that we don't realize how dirty the water is. And so we need some perspectives to come in and help us think about that. So I think definitely utilizing people that we trust to come in and tell us the good and the not so good is often really helpful. And thinking about in a culture that's driven by data, I think data is helpful, but like recognizing what type of data is seen as valuable by the organizational leadership. Quantitative surveys are beautiful, but it can only tell you so much, because it's actually, it's still comparing to a norm and a dominant experience. And so really thinking about, who are, and at the same time, if I can do a both and, also not just going to the people of color saying what's wrong and what's good, because it's also then putting more burden on them to have to be witness and truth tellers to what's happening. So I think there's a couple of things that of ways for us to think about it. Thinking about, looking at who gets promoted, who doesn't get promoted in the organization. If you look at the data, right? And who are the folks that are departing? Why are they departing? Are we actually asking them why, what's happening? And are we thinking about, while we have all these pipeline programs, are those pipeline programs actually leading to diversity in the boardroom? And is that actually shifting who's at the table and who has access to power and power system? Are we able to do a power analysis and power mapping and see, what is the racial identity of these people? And is that connected to layering that with colorism, layering that with immigration pattern, layering that with gender identity and sexual orientation, and seeing how that as soon as you start to kind of break down that power system and understand the dynamics, it becomes super white, upper middle class, male, cis, US, European centric body size people, right? And so we know that. So I don't think anyone would be surprised by that. I think that's one of the ways to do it. And really just, one of my favorite quotes says, it takes a great leader to lead and stand, but it takes an even stronger leader to sit and listen. And so really listening to that and actually listening to what people are actually saying and what people are doing is really helpful. And thinking about, where are the people of color going? Where are the white folks going? Are folks, are these white folks, especially if they're managers, are they actually feeling like they have access to resources to learn how to decolonize their own consciousness? And are we actually supporting their discomfort so it's not falling on the work of people of color to do that work for them and managing it up with their supervisors? Or are we expecting them to do that themselves? Asking why, we think about policies and practices and we're just assume that this is normal, right? An annual review and our rubrics, it's all great. And I think, having good data is important, but then like, why do we do it this way? Why are we asking these questions? Who came up with these questions? Do these questions even matter right now? Or are these questions actually relevant to who we are supporting now? I talk about this with admissions counselors all the time. When we think about student development and access points, the metrics that we use were still things that were created in the 1920s and 30s, and that's not our student bodies today. So are we actually developing systems that actually help us get a picture of what's happening? And then also thinking about actually going to the professional standards and trying to figure out, like, are we setting professional standards that are actually intentional about supporting individuals' growth-mindedness and strength rather than focusing on their deficits or lack thereof and what's happening. And then also I think about the HR departments have a lot of power in organizations and often can bring in people or filter people out simply for standards that, why do you need a master's degree for an administrative level position? Is that necessary? And if so, what type of master's degrees are you looking for? And who gets to decide that? And how is that then allowing for certain people to get in and other people to be intentionally left out? And so there's a lot of intentional, unintentional barriers that are set up. So those are all kind of different structures that exist in workplaces.
Wow, I love that response, Raja. I think it definitely sheds light on the importance of analyzing, right, the policy structures and the relevance and the applicability of those structures within the paradigm that we're operating. Thank you for that answer. So Anise, this question is for you. What may be some common mistakes or pitfalls that managers fall into when trying to create an anti-racist organizational change?
Yeah, and I think before diving into specifics for this question, it actually ties in perfectly to the last question, what Raja was sharing. When we're exploring, how to identify racist practices, I just want to pose the question of what are we centering, even in the framing of that question, even in the framing of the conversation, right? If we look at the history of this country, both in how it was founded through colonization and enslavement, right? It was very much founded in both genocide and also in racism. So when we're asking these questions of how can I identify, one very powerful framing tool that folks can switch towards is, we have all of this information now, we have all of this evidence. There's so much that shows how everything from access to loans or redlining or access to education or access to wellness resources has really shaped who is in the business landscape and in what position, right? Whether it's a leadership position or a position without as much power or capital or pay available. And really just normalize, this is the reality of where we are. The reality of where we are is that we are in a country with very racist systems and structures, and that our businesses are not somehow immune to that. So we should be starting from there rather than trying to identify, in what ways are we outside, are we outside of the norm, and in what ways are we then racist? Right? And so I think there's a framing flip opportunity there that can really help illuminate, some of the ways in which racism continues to show up in workplaces across industries. What I love about what Raja brought up is talking about, academia. Across the panelists, we all work across a number of industries, and we're seeing this surface in every pocket. So when we start getting into some of the common mistakes and pitfalls make, particularly for managers, right? I think that framing is very important in positionality, right? As a manager, you have access to a greater degree of power and hierarchy and resources and influence than maybe an individual contributor, right? It might be a different amount of power relative to a senior leader, and that power differential might be felt, to be real honest. But there is a certain amount of power associated with that role. So one mistake that I see managers make is ignoring that power dynamic or trying to imply that it doesn't exist. It exists. It's very real. There are very real repercussions if a manager has a negative reaction to something someone does or says, especially in a country where our healthcare, our housing, our food security can be tied to our wage labor. There's a lot of power in that. So I think one, mistake I've been seeing managers kind of make, especially within this past year, and more people, getting, especially more white folks and white managers getting more invested in anti-racism work after the murder of George Floyd, is they forget that power dynamic exists. And so they want to come to these conversations, they want to create or impact change, and they don't understand why there might be some hesitancy or reluctance or pushback, or it's difficult to give that upward feedback. So that power dynamic is very real. And it's not going to go away overnight either. And this kind of leads to where managers need to be much more comfortable taking risks. So I love what Dr. Bowden brought up regarding investment, right? There's all investments, all adult learning, all change takes a degree of risk, right? And sometimes there might be some discomfort, or there might be some challenges, there might be some growth before you see the benefits of it. And other times you might see the benefits immediately right away. And I think, managers need to really ask themselves, am I genuinely willing to invest in this work? Or is it something where I just don't want to be perceived as racist? Because those are two very different things. And in that risk, you're going to encounter mistakes, right? And so learning how to apologize, learning more about restorative and transformative justice approaches, learning more about centering mutual aid and centering the wants and needs of your employees is going to lend some frameworks for when those mistakes do happen. What do I do next? How do I avoid getting trapped in this shame and guilt spiral? Because ultimately it is a privilege to sit in that shame and guilt and not to sit in accountability and sit in growth. Because the folks who might be experiencing the harm of that environment or the harm of your actions and behavior, they're still going to be experiencing it perhaps even tenfold, right, as you are going through your growth journey. The third thing that really comes up for me, and I see this across organizations, is just an extreme underinvestment in this work. It is a moral loss, a spiritual loss. It is a business loss when we think about who, consumers or customers or users or experiencers or learners of different products and, environments and pieces of information are. It's a really diverse range, right? So, there's a loss there. There's a moral loss as well, where underinvesting in these things or not seeing how they're deeply integral into how we work, falling into this trap of, there should be no politics in the workplace when work is inherently political, right? From who we invest in for supply chains, whatever our industry might be, all the way through, pay equity. A lot of businesses get involved in their local communities and influence policies there. So I just see this kind of consistent underinvestment, and these frameworks, these lenses, their skills, their expertise, their muscles you develop over time. Everyone on this panel has poured a lot of time and effort into continuing to hone their knowledge, to hone their craft, to expand their communication skills, their interpersonal skills, their knowledge of history and sociology and philosophy. And it's investment. And this needs to be as invested in and as important for you as any other business skill that you might learn.
Thank you, Anise. That response is a perfect segue to our next question. So Alfredo, this is a question for you. How can a manager navigate potential pushback from senior leadership when trying to create an anti-racist workplace? And how can you get buy-in from those you need buy-in from?
Thank you for that, Araceli. Anise, your answer was fire. I just want to say that. Thank you for sharing that. One of the and this particular, I think, answer to me is informed by that last question around what are some of the pitfalls that managers sometimes make, right? And one of the things that I've seen a lot of managers unfortunately do is rush to become or try to become champions or advocates for creating an anti-racist organization without understanding their personal why, right? And so when we think about, folks that are interested, that are excited about, really moving an organization forward, I always ask them about, what work have you done personally? How much have you invested in your own growth? Because we're all conditioned, right, to buy into these, capitalistic, racist ideas and norms, right? And so it takes work to unlearn that and to really reimagine a different approach and a different framework. And so as managers, I always tell them, before you go and try to advocate for these things, you have to be clear as to what your why is. You have to understand, what does it mean for you as a manager to create an anti-racist culture for your team, for the most junior member of your team? What does that look like for you? Because unless you're clear about that, when you go and advocate to your, folks in leadership, you're gonna get stuck. You're gonna get, people are gonna start poking through your asks and your requests. And the minute people start poking through it and you don't have a clear goal, a clear understanding, a clear framework of or idea of what an anti-racist organization can look like, then the leader's not going to buy into it, right? So you have to do your homework. You have to really be clear and invest in understanding what that looks like at your level before you're going to advocate, right? The other piece that I tell folks all the time is figure out your tools. Look at the landscape. Look at what tools you have disposable. Get to know what is the bottom line for your leader, right? Many leaders are all about numbers. I want data. I want research. As much as I'm a person that believes that I should not be convincing you, to create an anti-racist workplace, I understand that sometimes the people empowered need those numbers and need that data. And so if you're a manager that's going to go and advocate for this and is going to be a champion, get to know what that bottom line is for your leaders. Maybe the leader just needs to know, that this will be something that the company can be known for, right? Maybe maybe your organization is going through this period of, wanting to excel and be seen as a leader within their industry. Use that angle, right? Understand what is that the leverage that you can take to a leader and say, this is why we should be doing this. It might be that research and data. It might be because you want to, highlight and show your organization as being different and being at the front lines of creating anti-racist workplaces. But it's important for you to really, as a manager, to understand what your leverage is, what your tools are, right? It's super, super important. One of the things that we do a lot with our leaders, typically in terms of getting buy-in, is having what I like to call primers, right? Oftentimes I encounter leaders who are excited about doing DEI work, who are excited about talking about anti-racism, but ultimately don't really understand what it means and what it takes. And so, they go into the work, or they go into, doing this type of, or trying to get their organization to move forward. But once we start poking and saying, oh, okay, so this is a practice that you have to, that is no longer serving that purpose, or this is a policy that is perpetuating inequities, right? Then that's when leaders start to kind of recoil a little bit, or they start, giving us the buts and the ifs. And so for us, it's important to prime those leaders before we get into the actual work and say, this is what it takes. This is what doing DEI work means, right? This is what anti-racism actually looks like. Are you willing to go in that direction? Are you willing to invest? And that's a hard question, right? Because folks, we're asking them to be honest. But I'd rather get that honesty from someone and say, you know what? Yes, but no, I can work with that, as opposed to someone who's saying, yeah, let's do it. And then once we're in doing the work, they're being really resistant, right? One of the exercises that I love doing with leaders is what I call this inner circle inventory, right? And what I have them do is really do some reflection and think about, just look around you. Look at the people you go for advice. Look at the people that are directly under you. Look at the people who have mentored you. What leaders do you typically reach out to when you're looking for input and advice, right? what does that sphere look like? What does that inner circle look like? And typically what we see is that it looks very much like them, typically cisgender white men, typically folks that, have a very similar perspective and point of view. And so for me, I use that exercise as a mirror, right? I'm not telling you you're a bad person or you're, wrong for being who you are. What I'm saying is, if you look at who's around you, it's very limiting, right? And so that typically helps prime folks to have that aha moment of, oh, you're right. Maybe if I start expanding that, maybe if I start, expanding who I reach out to, right? And then the other thing that we'd like to talk to leaders often about is this idea of the infallibility threat. One of the biggest roadblocks that I see to leaders really opening up to change, transformational change, is this idea of being vulnerable and saying, I don't know, or saying I messed up. Right. And when I get folks telling me, I'm just afraid of saying the wrong thing and messing up, I often tell them, mistakes have already happened. So if you're afraid of making mistakes, I can probably look at 2 years of your organization in the past and point out several mistakes. So if that's a fear you have, fear no more, because you've already done it. Right. And I tell them, I've done that too. I'm a practitioner with 12 years experience. I still mess up, right? And so giving leaders the permission to say, you know what, it's okay if you mess up. Like, don't let that hold you back. And this idea of the infallibility threat, right? That somehow, because you're a leader, we understand that, again, capitalistic norms, racist norms have put you in this pedestal of you have to have all the answers. You can't mess up. And saying that's wrong, right? Like, it's okay if you don't know, if you don't have the answer. That vulnerability is what's going to make really a transformation organization-wide. And so it's important for you as a manager, relating it back to the question, to understand these pieces so that when you're working with your leaders, you understand what angle to come in from, right? But I will go back to that first piece. I tell folks all the time, don't go to your leader saying, let's do this, let's implement this, if you have not done your own homework, because it's going to come and bite you in the end. And so start with that personal investment, start with that personal understanding, what is your why? What is driving the work you're doing? Because that's going to eventually influence the work that you're doing with your leader. And so, I would say definitely things to think about. The last thing I will say is, one of the things that I like to think about often when I'm thinking about working with leaders is, what is ultimately going to make them excited about this work, right? It's not just that they're invested and they're passionate, but I want them to be excited. Because to me, I wake up every day to do this work and I get pumped. I'm like, let's get to it. Let's transform the way we do things. And I want to get my leaders there. And, one thing we know about organizations and leaders in particular is they're always thinking about innovation, right? Innovation drives a lot of business, innovation drives a lot of work, right? And so I talk to them, I say, why not be that organization that's doing it differently? Why not commit to these principles and be public about it and be known in your industry for being that organization that is changing it up, that has paid transparency, that looks at their leadership and asks the question, why are we all cis men that are white? Like be that organization, because ultimately that's going to drive that innovation. You're going to be known in your industry, and that typically gets folks really excited, right? So again, think about your angle, use it as leverage when you're working with those leaders.
Wow, Alfredo, I loved that answer. You mentioned Anise is on fire. I think all of you are on fire. I'm so inspired and happy that we're all here today having these very pressing, important, timely conversations. So Tiffany, the next question is for you. Definitions and expectations of professionalism can be and are problematic. How do we redefine professionalism in the workplace with an anti-racist lens?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a really good question, and it's one that hits home for me as someone who's traveled through a lot of corporate environments, as well as environments as a contractor. So I can speak on this from a personal space as well. First, let's just kind of start with what the definition of professionalism even is. In the most quote unquote neutral space it's the conduct, aims, qualities that characterize or mark a profession or a professional person, or the competence or skill expected of a professional. On its face, it feels kind of neutral, but of course, when we think of this word professional, a lot of people have different thoughts in mind. I was in a internship program, and we actually did a research study where everyone was asked to select who they thought was the more professional when we were shown different magazine pictures. And what was interesting is that we, most of the participants who were in that study, more often than not, were selecting white men as that reflection of professional. They were also selecting participants who were in suits and ties and, more like the traditional cultural, Western gear, if you will. And this was even interesting when you had, say, a Black woman who was actually in a suit, but then you also had maybe a white man that was not in a suit. They would still actually choose the white man as more professional. So there's something that's going on there in this professional landscape. Another story, like when I was in high school, I wanted to, it was actually in college, I wanted to do the Disney internship program. And I quickly found out that I would not be able to participate in this program because they had professional development standards that I could not meet, in which case it had to do with my hair. I had to have straight hair, and it had to be able to be pulled into a ponytail, and it had to be done a certain way. So I was told within the interview that the way that I looked was not professional, even though it just had something to do with my hair. And for those of you who cannot see what my hair looks like, I have small dreadlocks, what they're called pencil locks. And I actually do natural hair modeling. So I have a lot of experience with styling my hair in all sorts of creative fashions. I also, in being a model, and I was classically trained in that regard, I went to one of my go-sees, and I showed up on site, and there was another commentary about my hair where they said, you look great, except for I'm not sure exactly how your hair will transition into a professional look. And it's like, what exactly does that mean? What is it? Why would it need to transition into a professional look? Like, what exactly are you expecting for my hair to do? Because I can put it into a bun, I can have it straight, I can make it curly, I can do all of these things. But when we go back to that definition of professionalism, did I know how to do my job? Certainly. If I were to do my Disney internship, would I have known how to do my job? Of course. And certainly that's the case with people of color who are on the job, and women who are on the job all the time. They know how to do their jobs, but they might still be deemed unprofessional, because this standard of professionalism was ultimately built by white men for white men, and it is pushing a particular kind of homogeneity. And that is something that, really ultimately needs to be evaluated. So ultimately, what can we do to redefine this? I have a couple of ideas on this, but certainly my voice is not the only voice of authority on this. But broadening organizational definitions of professionalism would be a really great start, and that would start from removing dress codes altogether. They're usually unnecessary, and also learning about different cultures without othering, and training managers on legislation that have to do with people's appearances or touching other people within the workplace, that goes beyond the sexual harassment training work and into legislation such as the Crown Act. It's really unfortunate that we've needed legislation to tell people not to touch people's hair in the workplace. But here we are. So, educating on those types of things, opening up creative expression for all people, without that being specific to culture or anything. Like, when you ultimately are inviting creative expression for everyone, that ultimately helps everybody, as well as training on emotional literacy. So sometimes women are considered to be unprofessional because of their perceived emotions. And, some organizations who are leading from a different point of strength can understand, all human beings have emotions and there are certain kinds of biases that are making us focus on women as having emotions. And sometimes it is actually a mark of strength and bravery and, what we actually really need to be leaning into to be able to demonstrate these things, yes, even in the workplace. And so having some training on emotional literacy can also help to strengthen this broader view. Also honoring everyone's spirituality and culture. So avoiding language saying that, oh, someone looks funny or they look different, and this should go without saying, but I frequently run into these kinds of scenarios, which it's kind of hard to believe in 2021 in this climate that we still have to have those conversations. But that is there as well. And, re-examining company holidays, of course, as well as, finally just allowing just more work-life balance and supportive benefits in general. So that looks like allowing people to take the time that they need to care for themselves. It could be maybe they need to take a moment in their day to pause, or maybe they need to take a day or a week. And as long as they're able to get their work done, then that should ultimately be something that we push for. And it can be something that, whether it's that they need the time to take care of themselves or to take care of their family, and redefining what we are calling family in the workplace, because not everybody has the same vision and view of family. And so having a more expanded thought process on that is also important. So we don't need to regulate as many things as we think that we need to regulate, and just focus on allowing people to be their best selves and show up for work.
Thank you, Tiffany. Raja, would you like to chime in as to this question?
Yeah, I love what Dr. Bowden just shared, and it makes me think of so many interesting things. I'll just share one really funny story that made me think about just the I don't know, what's the nice way to say it? I don't know. So I was a finalist for an associate dean of diversity job a couple of years ago at a pretty progressive campus. And so I walked into, and I wore my suit, but I don't wear ties, and so I wore a scarf. But I did my, you do the dance, right? It's the how much are you gonna do? And I was like, okay, I'm gonna wear the suit. But and in my conversation with the vice president in my last interview, we were talking about professionalism, and I was like, well, if I were to come in today in my traditional Indian garb, what would you say? And she's like, oh, you wouldn't have even been allowed in the room. And this is for a diversity job on a fairly progressive campus. And I was like, wow, so, and at that point I was like, I have to leave, thank you. And I just left. And because I was like, it was so, I didn't, even for a well-meaning white person, I expected just a better, at least a more subtle response of oh, well, but no, she was like, no, you wouldn't even be allowed. And it's like, wow. So these notions of professionalism, where for me, my Indian garb is actually more authentic and more spiritual and more professional, if you will, and actually more traditional than this suit that I wear that isn't part of my, I hate wearing suits. And so just really fascinating, right? To think about how professional plays out. And even today I was like, do I just wear a t-shirt? Do I not? And we are so internalized these messages about what professionalism is without even knowing it. And yet I think often become our own kind of internal judges, and there's a lot of horizontal oppression that happens around professionalism too, in well-meaning people, right? I've had multiple people of color say, oh, you shouldn't do this, or you should wear this, or you should pass this way, and trying to figure out how to do that and not feel like I'm giving up my piece of myself to survive. And it's that's clearly a sign of a racist and ethnocentric and Anglocentric experience.
So I'd like to turn it over now to, there are a couple of questions posed by our attendees, and I'd like to address these, given that we are doing good on time. So Mindy poses the following question. Our work environment declared we would be anti-racist. We got quite a bit of pushback. Some said we should say anti-racism versus anti-racist. Thoughts?
Why not both? So I guess, it's hard to understand the total context of this question. One, nonverbal communication is definitely missing in written text, and two, there's not further details offered about the workplace environment. At least the way in which I'm experiencing this question is it sounds like within the organization, there might have been a bit more focus and attention on the naming of the work versus committing to it. And that is a kind of frequent opt-out we do see across workplace environments where, folks will sometimes get very stuck in some of those very initial first steps and being either afraid to take a risk or afraid to make a mistake and never move beyond that. The reason why I somewhat sassily said, why not both, is, the anti-racism work is the practice of starting to uproot and abolish racism out of all of these different pervasive ways in which it exists in all of the environments we're a part of. Our workplace environment is just one facet of that. It includes ourselves, it includes our communities, it includes, the other portions of society we participate in. But to say also then that doesn't mean we can't be, anti-racist. I guess the way I'm interpreting this is if there are racist folks or folks complicit in racism, we're now starting to get more hung up on words than acknowledging the ways in which we might be interpersonally violent, either with good intentions or unintentionally or unconsciously. And sometimes this interpersonal violence is referred to as a microaggression, all the way through the ways in which we might be complicit in upholding systemic racism. So this could be, the examples described of, inappropriately touching someone's hair or saying that natural or kinky hair or curly hair is unprofessional, all the way through, saying that someone's outfit or garb that is authentic to them and to their culture is unprofessional. In the context of that environment, it would be considered professional. So those are some of the things that start coming top of mind when I hear questions like this.
Tiffany, any thoughts?
Yeah, without knowing the context of this debate between anti-racism and anti-racist, what came to me is that this sounds like a kind of microaggression that I encounter in workplaces, where what we would call this is cognitive resistance. And ultimately what this is that people are not willing to do the work. They're not willing to take it in, and it's getting blocked at this mental level. And instead it's being deflected. Now they're ultimately engaging with it. So, they might passionately argue about it. They might, ultimately be engaging on that mental level, but they're really not doing the self-reflection and just simply holding it and then taking action. Some other ways that this might come up is that they might change the subject. They might ultimately destroy the plan altogether. But usually it often shows itself in like endless debate. And ultimately, when you really look at this thing, it's like, you don't really do a whole lot of changing racism by getting the perfect term and like having people stay in this mental gridlock. A lot of this comes at the heart level and caring about your fellow human being. This is ultimately at the center of this work. And when people can't get to that level, then it's more about just changing the systems so that we bring those other people on board, and we'll get to those folks when we need to. But ultimately, debating these terms is not really what's central to this work, unless of course we're talking about things like pronouns and people's personal identities and such. But really, I would encourage you to just really center them back in what this work is all about.
Any final thoughts regarding this, Alfredo?
Well, I was just thinking, again, you all said it, right? We don't have the full context, but I often think about, sometimes there's this desire to, there's that famous like nose go, right? Where you touch your nose and it's not your turn. And I often hear in conversations like this idea of, yes, racism is a bad thing, and we shouldn't, we should be against it, but it's not me, right? Like I'm not part of it. I'm not perpetuating it, right? And so I think it's just it's always important to question and to investigate where are some of those feelings coming from, and where is some of that resistance coming from, right? Is denial part of it? Is there a personal denial that is informing our feelings towards it? I always say, like, denial is one of the is what fuels racism, right? Like if we deny it, then it lets it flourish. And so but I think to what Tiffany just said too, right? Like, we can't get bogged down in some of these words. Is your organization talking about racism, or is it doing something about it, right? Like, is it fighting it? Because those are two very different things, right? I get invited often to hold conversations and hold speaking circles, and those are great. But I always ask folks, what else are you doing? Because if this is what all we're providing for your employees, like, maybe that's the first step, but you should be taking action beyond that. And so let us not get bogged down by words and terminology.
Okay, the second question posed by Oscar Rodriguez. I think this is I really like this question. He says, what is the difference, if any, of creating an anti-racist workplace versus creating an inclusive, diverse, equitable, and just workplace? If there's not a difference, then why frame it as anti-racist? Thoughts?
So I can just speak briefly on this. I think that we should be doing the latter all the time, and these things don't really compete against each other. But when you are specifically calling out that you're doing anti-racist work, you're dealing with the issue of racism. With the other approach, you can be dealing with gender inequity, you can be dealing with religion, you can be dealing with pay equity, you can be dealing with a host of different issues. But if you are taking that approach and then you also don't specifically call out racism, it's a kind of bypassing of the issue. So if you're going to deal with racism, then you need to specifically call it by its name. If you want to deal with sexism or misogyny specifically, then you call it by its name. Anything that you're wanting to take on head on, you have more power in being able to actually show a mirror up to it, rather than kind of painting this thing with broad strokes. But in general, we're all doing this work of diversity, inclusion, and justice work.
Thank you, Tiffany. The next question is for all panelists.
Sally, I think Raja might have their hand raised.
Oh, my apologies. Yes, Raja, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, thanks, Anise. I think it's the brown hand kind of gets lost in the plants. Again, technology problems, right? Of like, what does it mean that you can see the yellow hand, which is also just weirdly what is a yellow hand? Why are we doing Simpsons work here? Anyways, long story. That's another conversation around racism via Zoom, right? And racism, right? Versus justice work, right? It's connected. I think to what Tiffany said, I would just add that I would probably say 99.99% of all the other isms, the way it manifests on our workplaces is often connected to race because of the inherent racist structures that are built on what has made this nation what it is. And so I'm a believer that the US would not exist as it is had it not been for the oppression of Indigenous, Black, Asian, Latinx, et cetera, communities. And so I do think naming anti-racist is, seems bold, but it's not. It's actually, it's because it's getting at the roots rather than getting at just the leaves of the issue. And I think it's often what's scarier, because often then you can't hide behind, oh, we're all just happy-go-lucky, we can do justice work together. There's this kind of sense of kumbaya moment, if you will. And yet at the same time, often then lets people feel the sense of false unity without actually addressing the barriers that actually are literally impacting people's lives in the work that we do around race and racism and racist organizations and I would say, I know I'm complicit to that as well, having lived in this country for most of my life. And it's part of the ways that we are cultured, unfortunately. And so it requires deeper and more painful work.
Thank you, Raja. So on that note, we have our very final question. If each of you could take about a minute, it's 2:56. So I would love to have this conversation go on for hours upon hours, and I think our attendees would agree. But yes, if you could all take about a minute to answer this. The question is, what are one or two concrete steps that our attendees can take to begin building anti-racist spaces in their own workplace? We'll start off with Raja.
I'm going to punt to Anise, actually, because I know she had her hand raised, so maybe you can add that.
Okay.
Thank you. I just, quickly wrapping back to that last question, I think this is also where when we are doing anti-racism work and we are, really being precise in naming white supremacy, there's an opportunity to learn more about how capitalism as an approach has upheld white supremacy and what that has meant in terms of exploitation of people and resources, folks' energy and well-being. And through those lenses, you start to see intersectionality, right? Or the experiences folks have at the intersection of different identities. And it, to Raja's point, and just to double underscore it, it is almost impossible. And you know what, I'll say it's impossible. It is impossible in this country, given the racist systems and structures in which this country was founded and created and leveraged for certain people to hoard wealth and hoard access and hoard resources and hoard comfort, to take racism out of that equation. So when we start getting into these conversations of whataboutisms, to Tiffany's point, Dr. Bowden's point, it's not a competition. These things are deeply interlinked. So even, just kind of investigating and reflecting on, this is a workshop or, a panel on anti-racism in the workplace. So noting upfront, that's what we're centering in conversation, and perhaps what discomfort or what, what led to kind of exploring, okay, even in this space, how are we stepping away from anti-racism work and using more broad language or more, I'll leave it at that, more broad language. So even that as a self-reflection opportunity, going back to what Alfredo was talking about earlier of how are we reflecting on what we're doing here, right? Raja, I love that you brought up that we're all complicit in this because we're all living and existing in this environment, in this soup we're swimming in. Even for myself, like I'll call myself in, I forgot and then did not at other opportunities describe myself or my background for folks who have low vision, right? And that is not being inclusive of folks who are disabled or where that might have been very helpful. So I just, there's so much work that can take place, and I'll tie this into the 1 to 2 takeaways to pass the mic. But maybe that's one really critical takeaway that we all leave this space with is, what are the lanes we have access to? And that includes our own self-reflection and thinking about the influence and impact we have on those around us, particularly if we hold positions of power, like being a manager in workplace environments. Thanks, team, for being patient.
Alfredo, would you like to chime in regarding that?
Sure, I'll be quick as I can be. I like to tell folks whenever I do this work with different organizations, don't ghost the process when it gets hard, right? That's one of the biggest things that I ask folks when they're engaging in this work is, if you're going to commit full head, right? Like, it's going to get hard at times. It's going to feel overwhelming. It might feel complex and complicated. Maybe it won't, but there's a chance that you'll find a place where you're like, oh, I'm being asked to give this up, or I'm being asked to share this, or relinquish this piece, right? And you shouldn't ghost the process for that fear. Anti-racism is a line that is not a line that we're going to cross, right? It's going to be a journey that we're going to be on for a very long time. I tell folks all the time, if you find somebody who told you I've reached the mountaintop, run as fast as you can the other way, because that is not someone who has really figured it out, right? This is going to be a journey we're going to always be on, and it's a constant. It requires constant reflection. Speak up, not over, folks, right? This is particular for those that are trying to be an allyship with folks of color. If you feel so called to become someone who is passionate and wants to do this work, learn to speak up, but not over people of color, right? It's important that you take a cue from from your colleagues of color in doing this work, while also not putting all the onus and work on them. So it's a balance, but it's one that if you're committed to this work, you're willing to take on. That's my final say.
Dr. Bowden?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think that there's dimensions to this depending on your adjacency to power. So, you know, if you're someone who's in leadership within an organization and you can advocate for or bring on a chief diversity officer, that is certainly something that could really help to make a difference in space, and make sure that they're given significant budget, as well as, you know, where possible, make sure that they report to the CEO. More often than not, they're usually within human resources departments, which gets into a whole different kind of way that these structures can impact what kind of work can be done. So giving that person and the group that they would be bringing on the ability to have the ear of the CEO and also the power to be able to make a difference is important. If you are finding yourself in the position of not being in leadership, but you want to be an ally or an accomplice, you know, start with the work within yourself. So many of the participants have already kind of mentioned this, but educating yourself about the ways that you benefit from racism and making conscious decisions to give up some of those spaces, and knowing that, you know, if you have privilege, it doesn't ultimately make you a bad person, but it does mean that you have the power to make a difference with the power that you have. You know, if you want to dive deeper into that work, I, as well as probably some of the other panelists, can help you along that work, and our doors remain open for that kind of work. If you're a person of color, my message is a little bit different. Know that it is okay to rest. It is okay to say no. It's okay to have boundaries, and it's okay to get paid for your labor. You don't have to be the representative for whatever your presumed group is. It's okay for you to show up in different ways than what the quote unquote dominant group is, because you're not in some kind of a monolith. So it is okay for you to express your individuality. Joy and rest are their own forms of resistance. So, you know, feel free to lean into those things.
So Raja, and then we'll hand it over to Gerald for closing remarks.
Thank you, Araceli. I ditto everything that everyone has said. I think the two things that are sticking with me, that are coming to my heart right now, is one, maybe three things. I'll do three. One is, you know, let go of deficit thinking. I think often so many of us feel like we have to either, if we don't do, it's not going to happen, or that if we do this for this group, then that group won't move. Like, there's more than enough in our organization to actually do all the work and still be okay, and know that the work is Alfredo's perspective, like, it's never ending. Like, there is never going to be a line where we've crossed, like we've found the promised land. And so that's really important. Two is, you know, when you hire people, particularly if you're hiring people of color and trying to bring fresh perspectives and intentional diversity, don't hire that one person, because that's actually really setting them up to fail. And so hire in cohorts and say, we're not just going to bring in 3 or 4 people, and allow them to actually feel a sense of community and feel like they don't have to feel like they have to represent all blank identified people, because that's most often than not. I can't remember the last time that a white, cis, straight, hetero man felt like he was the only one in a room, right? And because so often people making those decisions often don't know that. And the last thing is build community. I think, you know, it's like this work is too hard to do by ourselves, and we don't have to do it ourselves. And so finding our people, whether it's within the organization or outside the organization, is essential to keeping us grounded and keeping us healing in this work, and recognizing that, like, our liberation is collective, our liberation is intentional, our liberation is revolutionary.
Thank you, Raja. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Gerald.
Perfect. To close out, just want to say a very big thank you to Araceli for moderating this this panel, and a very, very big thank you to all 4 of our panelists. This was really an incredible conversation, very, very insightful, but also just very real, and a lot of great things for all of us to think about and continue the conversation throughout the summit, but also long after the summit too. So just a very big thank you. For our attendees, thank you for coming to this. We thank you all again for joining us in this space, and we thank our panelists, and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you, everyone.